Hello. Today I will be discussing the upcoming buff to the Shimakaze and what exactly it means to it. Now, for those that aren't aware, they are planning on changing the Shimakaze torpedoes. The Type 93 Mod 3, aka the 12 km torps, are getting their concealment changed from 1.9 to 1.7 km, and the F3 torps are having theirs changed from 1.9 to 1.8. Now, the game I'm featuring here in the background, I queued solo, but two Omni guys in tier 8 ships happen to be in this, so they invited me to the division, so I'm technically in a T8 division. It wasn't a fail queue, so don't worry about that. Anyway, or a fail division, whatever. Anyway, moving on. What does this concealment change mean? Well, first of all, I'm going to be mostly focusing on the 12 km torps because I don't believe the change to the F3 torps is enough to still make them viable, because the huge issues that led me to eventually give up F3 torps are still in the game, which is of course all the radars, all the hydras, all these issues, the random spotter planes, especially with the dual spotter plane perk, and all these things that easily get you spotted and makes going into range of using these torps too risky. So I'm probably still going to be using the 12 km torps. But what exactly does this concealment change mean? Well, we need to start off first with seeing how this affects the reaction time. Now, there's actually a formula for this. Usually you would just take the detectability of the torpedoes and divide it by the torpedo speed. That's the simple way of seeing how far away you would spot it. The issue here is of course that the game has its own units. They don't really correspond directly to real-world units or speed or scale. That was, by the way, RPF torps. I sent those out based on RPF. So another use for this perk, of course, when you go into caps. But anyway, the in-game units don't really correspond that well with actual real-world units. So ultimately, with a huge amount of testing, people have managed to figure out that we need to add a conversion to this formula, and that is we need to add torpedo visibility in meters divided by speed in knots times 26. And this is the formula you can use to calculate the reaction time of the target you are torpedoing. So in the case of the Shima Type93 Mod 3, I'm just going to call them Mod 3s in the future so I don't have to say that entire thing. In the case of the Mod 3, we have of course 1.9 km concealment on the torps right now. The torps are 67 knots fast, and of course we add the 2.6 conversion and we end up with 10.9. Now this is 10.9 seconds of spotting time, basically, or reaction time. So if you spot a torp, a Shimakaze, this type of torp, you will have 10.9 seconds to react before the torpedo actually hits your ship. Now note that this, of course, this changes depending on if you're sailing away from the torp or if you're sailing towards the torp, but this method of calculating this is based on a ship basically either sitting still or sailing full broadside and having exactly this much time to react to the torpedoes. So when we buff this number, this 1.9 km concealment, aka the 1900 number, when we buff this to 1.7k, suddenly we drop down quite a lot from the 10.9 seconds. In fact, we drop down to a 9.8 second reaction time instead. And now this is a pretty damn big deal because this is pretty much a 10% buff to the reaction time. And it's been much requested and much needed because even though this buff seems like huge at first glance, it doesn't even compare to Fletcher or Gearing torps, because Fletcher or Gearing torps of course have a 1.4 km concealment, which is of course why USDD torps are much scarier than IGN torps. In fact, if we add that to our little calculator thing here, we can see that we get those torps have an 8.2 second reaction time. So not even these buff torps can really compete with those in detection. But that doesn't mean that this buff isn't significant, because if we add in a common perk like, let's say, vigilance, something battleships tend to run very, very often, which of course increases torpedo spotting by 25%. So these old torps that I'm using right now, this is on the live server, so these aren't the updated torps. A battleship or any ship running Vigilance, in fact, would have 13.6 seconds to react, or has 13.6 seconds to react to these torps, whereas the buffed ones that are coming in the next patch, they will only have 12.2. So of course, since Vigilance adds percentage to the detection, the smaller your base number, the more valuable it is, or the lesser the gain from Vigilance. So this is of course once again a significant buff, and this will help these ships a lot. There has been some thought about Torpedo Acceleration, and this change will make running Torpedo Acceleration on the 12 km torps pretty interesting. Like, it's something I might explore and might experiment with, but ultimately it's going to be very questionable if I will run it or not. The reason, of course, is that the base speed of these torps are already so good. These torps already do 67 knots, so buffing that up to 72 doesn't really give you that much of an impact, or doesn't really change the reaction time too much. In case of, basically, the slower your torps are, the better their concealment. That's how the torps are usually balanced in this game. If you have very, very slow torps, they will usually have extremely good concealment. If you have fast torps, they will be spotted from miles away. But that, of course, means that Torpedo Acceleration greatly benefits slower torps. If we take, for example, the current F3 torps, which do 76 knots, and they have 1.9 km of concealment. So putting Torpedo Acceleration on these and buffing our speed from 76 to 81 knots will only reduce the reaction time of our target from 9.6 seconds to 9. So the actual gain we're getting here is roughly 6%. That's not too much. Whereas if we put Torpedo Acceleration on the USS Black, which has 0.9 km detection on the torps, but they only do 43 knots, and if we put Torpedo Acceleration and buff this to 48 knots, we reduce the reaction time from 8.2 to 7 point, from 8 exactly to 7.2, and that is exactly a 10% gain. So you can see that the same perk on the Shima F3s only gave me 6% in gain, whereas on the USS Black it gave me 10%. So you have to keep this in mind when you consider the usage of Torpedo Acceleration. You have to consider that the advantages you gain aren't necessarily as big as they might be on another ship using another sort of torps. Now, that doesn't automatically equal that slow torps are the best torps in the game either, because there's a lot of great equalizers in this game. For example, there's constant fighter planes, there's carrier planes, and there's even hydro. And of course, slow torps being spotted are, well, they're harder to spot, but something like hydro will of course spot them at the same time as fast torpedoes, and in this case you will have significantly less time to react to fast torpedoes than you will have to slow. So if a battleship, something like Grossi Korfos, runs in running hydro, he will have a lot more time reacting to slow torps than he will have to Shimakaze torps, even though he spots them at the same time, mostly because Shima torps are much faster. So there is a certain balance there, a balancing factor that is being added in there. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule. For example, a very common thing is running Torpedo Acceleration on the gearing. But the reason for this is because Torpedo Acceleration doesn't really add too much in the reaction time reduction. In fact, if we buff the gearing torps from 66 knots to 71, so you go from that 8.2 second reaction time we had earlier on gearing torps, you go to 7.6. So we're only getting a 7% gain, but we're giving up the 20% distance we're giving up, or the 20% range we're giving up on the torps, really isn't a big deal, because it already has a ridiculous 16.5 range that the gearing doesn't really even need or use. So that's a bit of an exception. You have more range than you really need, so running Torpedo Acceleration is a pretty much straight up buff instead of being a trade of range versus speed as it usually is. But that's of course the gearing, which the USDDs are a bit weird when it comes to torpedoes. They are surprisingly good at being torpedo boats. But ultimately though, now that you hopefully understand what this change means, it's going to be a very good change. It's something I wanted either slightly some stealthier torps for these IGN DDs so they can more consistently compete with US DDs, or I wanted better stealth for the Shimakaze, one or the other. I would have preferred, honestly, better stealth for the Shima, because that would have maybe made F3s more viable, but this is a very good buff as well, because honestly the Shima quite needs it. The Shima has no real consistency. The biggest issue with the Shimakaze is that it's very hard to consistently have good games in it. It can vary greatly depending on, of course, your torps, and your gun power really isn't strong enough to compensate that well for it. Even though I would argue that I use my guns better than the average player, it's still nowhere near any of the other DDs. And in a straight up fight, if they know what they're doing, you're gonna have a very, very hard time of coming out on top. This is of course for the upcoming patch, and the torpedoes you see here are still the Type 93 mod 3, aka the 12 km torps without torpedo acceleration, and more than likely these are exactly the same torps I will be using in the next patch as well. I will be testing some stuff like torpedo acceleration to see if it's worth the change. I will be testing a bunch of stuff as I usually do, but I don't really foresee any changes in my build, because I think my build adapts extremely well to the upcoming buff, and the Shima will continue being the Shima will be a stronger ship, which is needed, and the build should still remain very, very strong. So these are all good things. There's even been some talk about them removing the 20 km torps from the Shimakaze. In fact, I have strongly recommended that they remove the 20 km torps from the Shimakaze, because those torps are, of course, absolute ass. There's no real nice way of putting it. Those 20 km torps are the worst thing in the game, not just because they are incredibly unfun to have to play and grind through, but also because the average player doesn't understand what this torp concealment does. He doesn't even know where to see it in the stats. All he sees is, wow, they have so much range. That's all he sees. He doesn't understand that these torps having a terrible 2.5 km concealment means that the reaction time you have for these torps is absolutely ridiculous. And that's of course why I hate the 20 km torps, because not only are they useless, but they're also extremely confusing for the average new Shimakaze player who doesn't understand, and honestly doesn't even make any sense, that there is this armament that is so terrible that is being presented as a valid option. Even worse is these torpedo values that basically your torpedo rating goes up or down like completely independently of this concealment. It doesn't take into account this torpedo concealment at all, so it's even more confusing for the average player who doesn't really know how to read these stats, doesn't understand what these stats mean. So the purpose of this commentary was more to educate people on how the different torps work and how important it is that you keep in mind what the concealment does and how you can put it into your own calculations, and you can use it to decide, instead of having to ask someone else, do you think I should run torpedo acceleration on this and this ship, you can literally calculate it yourself. You just use the formula I've showed you multiple times in this vid, and you calculate it yourself. Do you think the gain of so and so many seconds or 0.x seconds is worth the trade of the 20% range? If you think it's worth it, get it. If you don't, don't. Ultimately though, there's not really many ships right now besides really the US black carriers and potentially the gearing on which I would consider using torpedo acceleration. On the rest, it's usually not really worth it because you have such a limited pool of points, and usually you really want the range. Anyway, the Shimakaze game in the background, which is of course using the old torps, ended. A pretty nice game. This was my first win of the day, hence all the XP. Managed to top the score, and of course perfectly balanced Kutuzov right behind me, even though it's a tier 8. But this is about the Shima, not that one. Managed to get the Kraken, which is always nice, and looking at overall damage, it's of course pretty much mainly torpedo focused and a pretty ridiculous amount of flooding as well, and of course the usual spotting damage, which you should always get a lot of as a DD, because if you're not getting a lot of spotting damage on a DD, especially in an IGN one, then you probably aren't doing your job very well. Anyway, that was all from me. I hope you guys learned something new today again, and I'll see you guys next time.